Thank you. All right, we've got 2 minutes to go. We'll wait till 8. We're madly letting people in.
Sure, that's great.
So turn up, right?
Can you ask citizens? People are talking. All right, good morning everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Reading and Writing Centre's Research to Practice series. I'm Jenny Peach, and I'm the Director of Speech Pathology, Language and Literacy at the Reading and Writing Centre. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all connecting today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their continuing connection to their culture, their lands, seas and waters across Australia. To all of you who are coming back to our Research to Practice series, welcome back. To those of you who are new to the Research to Practice series, welcome. This series is an initiative of the Reading and Writing Centre and is designed to bring together speech pathology researchers and practitioners to help bridge that gap between science and clinical practice. And of course, being the Reading and Writing Centre, our focus is on reading and writing. This series aims to enhance the Reading and Writing Centre's position as a centre for learning and development and a focal point for discussion and collaboration in what we call the inclusive teaching of reading and writing. So that's teaching reading and writing so that all children can access reading and writing instruction. It is my absolute pleasure this morning, and it's evening in Florida, to welcome and introduce Dr. Kelly Farquharson. Dr. Farquharson is an associate professor and director of the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound Lab at Florida State University. The mission of her work is to help children with speech and language impairment achieve classroom success, as it is with ours. She runs an active Instagram account at classlab_FSU, in which she posts about the clinical application of research. So this includes a popular weekly series called Phonetics Friday, which we should all try and log into. She has a related line of interest in working with school-based SLPs to ensure that they are prepared to implement best practices and work at the top of the license. Dr. Farquharson is also an affiliated faculty member with the Florida Center for Reading Research and is an editor for language, speech and hearing services in schools. Welcome, Kelly. I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning to all of you, which is an interesting thing to say at 6 p.m. my time. So I am excited that you were willing, and thank you again to Jenny and Donna for coordinating this event, and particularly for finding a time slot for us to all be together, because that is often the biggest challenge across these big time zones. But I'm so excited to be here today. I have never been to Australia in person, but it is high on my list of things to accomplish in this life. And so I've said when I do a sabbatical that Australia is my destination spot. So I've got several researcher friends who are in various parts of Australia that I'd love to visit, and several clinicians who I just adore and admire. I've met through Instagram that I'd love to come visit as well. So thank you again for inviting me. My name is Kelly Farquharson. I use she, her pronouns. And today I'm going to be presenting on the overlap between speech sound disorders and dyslexia. So Jenny covered most of this, but just some financial disclosures for you. I do receive a faculty from Florida State University where I am. I receive a salary as a faculty member there. I will tell you a little bit about my social media channels, and I do have a following on Instagram that has resulted in my ability to post affiliate links that that might result in a small commission for me, and share paid partnerships related to my research. My website includes links to other webinars for which I was previously paid to put together. I am the co-creator of the Embracing Expertise series with Bright Ideas Media, and I'll tell you about that at the end of our time together today. And I'm also in the process of developing resources with Bjorn Speech Publications. I'm an affiliated faculty member with Florida Center for Reading Research, and that's a non-financial disclosure. As Jenny indicated, I am the director of the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound or CLASS Lab. And we have a mission to help children with speech and language impairments achieve classroom success. And we run several studies a year. Some are longitudinal, some are cross-sectional, in which we are looking both at child level factors. So the children who we are interested in, primarily those who have speech sound disorders and who have perhaps overlapping dyslexia, but also children with developmental language disorder. But we also recruit SLPs to participate in our studies. And so we have some survey-based studies and some app-based studies that we have SLPs participate in. So far, that's primarily been school-based SLPs, but we certainly are interested in the application of research to all clinical settings, because we really have realized that our interest in helping this population of children is really only possible if we make sure that their SLPs feel equipped to implement best practices, and that's often a challenge in some settings. And so that's really become an additional line of research and mission through our work. And so we promote a lot of those projects during all stages, recruitment through publication, on our social media channels. And so our most popular one is Instagram, which is at @classlab_FSU. And as Jenny mentioned in my bio, I have a weekly series called Phonetics Friday. And it's mostly every Friday where we talk about the clinical application of phonetic science. So how to use what we know about phonetics to choose the correct sounds or the appropriate sounds or more appropriate sounds during your speech sound therapy. How to use our knowledge of phonetics to prompt a child to produce a sound correctly, and all kinds of fun, nerdy phonetics things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about a series that was developed, a continuing education series that was developed that came fully out of that, very serendipitously out of Phonetics Friday. I'll tell you about that at the end. But in the meantime, right now, we have kind of a pause on our Phonetics Friday because we're doing 31 days of resources for Better Hearing and Speech Month, which is an ASHA initiative, but certainly is an international endeavor to help improve access for better services for individuals with speech and hearing impairments. And so we're doing 31 days of resources, a new resource every day, and many of them have come out of Australia. So that's been wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, I think I've already said that. Of what I plan to cover during our time together. I am a fast talker, as you've already heard, and I do apologize that I'd much rather be listening to one of your beautiful Australian dialects, but here you are having to listen to my melting pot of American dialect. But here's what I plan to cover while we're together for this quick hour, is to talk about the phonological processing theory of reading, to list 3 phonological processing skills, and to outline ways to assess phonological processing abilities in children. But to do that, we're really going to kind of back up a step and talk about what reading is, what we mean when we talk about reading. And that will include a review of the simple view of reading as a first theoretical framework. And then we're gonna, even though we're probably all referring to the same population of children, we're gonna define speech sound disorders and define dyslexia, and then dig into the phonological processing theory of reading, which kind of fits in a way under the simple view of reading, if you're familiar with it. If you are just joining us, we are recording this. And so I will be sending the link, and it will be shared, I believe, on the Reading and Writing website. And you can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. So you'll have access to this if you're just joining us now. So I like to talk just quickly about how I came to study this population of children and how I got into this line of work. And, I was a school-based SLP for about 5 years in Pennsylvania, which is the state in the United States that I'm from, which is very far north from Florida, where I reside now, about, well, I don't know the kilometer conversion, but it's about 1,000 miles. And so it's pretty far away from where I live now, but all of these things that I'm going to talk about observing, I've observed in all the states that I've lived in. And so I was really seeing this pattern where I had this group of kids who were on my caseload when they were kindergartners, and there's young, like early 20s me. And then seeing this population of kids who were still on my caseload later on in their academic career. They're third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. So that's about, ages, depending, ages 9, 10, 11, 12, they're still receiving speech sound therapy. So as you notice, the number of kids dwindled, right? From when we think about a kindergarten population, about the ages of 5, as we move up through the grades to, upwards towards 12, some of these kids, there's fewer of them, but there are a lot of them that were still on my caseload. And I just really became perplexed by this population of kids. And I wanted to know more about what was going on with the population of kids who I wasn't able to dismiss from therapy, right? So they had been on my caseload for 4 or 5, 6 years, 4 or 5 years, because I was there for 5 years. And I was doing the same things in treatment as the other kids were experiencing, same kind of therapy, choosing my targets individually. But something was different about this population of kids. And so I kind of started making these observations, which I'm going to tell you about, but that's what led me to decide to go back to school to do my PhD, because I was never a person who had considered doing a PhD. So it was never, I'm not a lifelong goal PhD person. That was not, I didn't even want to go to college. So that was definitely not my goal, but I was so perplexed by this population of kids. I felt like I had to learn more. And so I did go back to do a PhD and to try to understand this problem that I'm presenting here. Now, what they don't tell you about getting a PhD is that it results in more questions. So that I did not know that. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the answers I've identified, but there's still just so much we don't know. And so I think in some ways, I'm hoping that that also makes you feel that it reassures you to a certain extent, because there's a lot we don't know about this population of kids, those who have speech sound disorders in general. We don't know what causes a lot of that. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we do know. And so I was kind of observing this matrix of kids where we got this, I've got 2 screens here, so I'm going to turn my attention from time to time over here. We've got kids who remediate, their speech sound disorder improves, right? And that's perhaps it's spontaneous development, but we're going to say it's because of our treatment, right? So they've improved because they've received our treatment. So has it improved or has it not? So has it remediated? Yes or no? And then along the left side here, we've got literacy problems. Do they have difficulties with literacy? Yes or no? And so in this first quadrant, we've got this population of kids where their speech sound disorder remediates, their speech improves, and there's no literacy problems. And so this is kind of like our gold star kids. These are the kids that we hope will be the majority composition of our caseload, that They improve in their speech sound production, which is what they came up to see us for, and they have no issues reading or writing in the classroom. So that's what we want to see, right? But that's not always what we see. So we see at least 3 other subgroups, at least in my experience, but there's probably more. So we've got the kids then who that don't remediate, so their speech sound production does not improve. And they have difficulties with literacy. So they are very strongly represented on the caseload that I had in Pennsylvania in the schools, where they just really hung on for a long time, having a difficult time improving their speech sound production, kind of despite our best efforts as a team. And they also had some literacy issues, so reading and or writing and spelling. So for those kids, it looks like perhaps they have kind of this true phonological deficit for everything that they need. Every reason they need to use the phonological system, they have a hard time. So for speech sound production, for reading, for spelling, all of it is really challenging. And then we've got the kids who don't remediate. So again, their speech sound production doesn't improve despite our best efforts, but there's no literacy issues. They do really well in the classroom, no decoding issues, no spelling issues. So perhaps those kids have more of a motoric deficit. They really perplex me. And then we've got the kids who kind of the last quadrant we'll talk about are the kids who they remediate. Yes, their speech sound production improves, but they have some literacy issues. So we'll talk a little bit about those kids too, because they go on to have difficulties in the classroom reading and or spelling, but their speech sound production has improved. So there's kind of this intersection where we get to ask ourselves a question: what's the role of the SLP? And that's going to vary quite substantially. And I'll say, and I do include some resources here that are pretty specific to school-based practice. My lens is very much the United States school-based practice setting. And so I've tried to kind of polish this in a way that is general school-based practice, or even just pediatric practice, not specific to schools, but please do kind of put all of this into context for yourself and take it with a grain of salt if there are things that aren't quite in alignment with the practice that you experience in your own setting. So this first question of just what is reading? What does reading actually comprise of? And I'm going to actually open the chat here. And if you don't mind, I'll ask this part to be interactive, so you can type in the chat. So I'm going to ask you to tell me who is actually engaging in the process of reading. So we've got this grandfather and this grandson, and what is more American than this grandfather and this grandson? If you're familiar with The Simpsons, which is a long-running cartoon in the US. And so we've got this grandfather who was born and raised in Germany, and a monolingual German speaker at the time. And when he was about in the 5th grade, about 10 years old, his family emigrated to the United States, where he has lived ever since and raised a family of his own. Now he's got this grandson who is in about the 3rd grade, about age 8. And the grandfather comes across this old German text that is just nostalgic for him. And he remembers that his mother used to read him stories from it. But, you know, he really didn't have a good, strong use of the German language at the time. And since, you know, he moved to the United States and started learning English at a very young age, he really hasn't learned German, relearned German in that time, or used it in a functional way. So he comes across this book and he wants to hear the stories from it because he remembers when his mother used to read him those stories. And so he asks his grandson, will you read these stories to me? And, you know, the grandson says, I don't know German. I can't read those to you. So the grandfather says, you know, just look at the words on the page and just try to sound it out. Just look at the words on the page and try to sound it out. So the grandson takes a look at the words on the page. And even though he doesn't know German, he does his best to sound out what he sees on the page. And actually, the grandfather is listening to this story and he's thinking, oh my goodness, I understand what you're saying. I remember some of this story. I remember that character's name. I remember that setting. And my mom used to read me these stories when I was a young boy in Germany. And so he's just flooded with nostalgia hearing this story for the first time in a very long time. And so based on that very short scenario without any additional information, the question is, who is reading? And your options are grandfather or grandson. So if you don't mind, in the chat, who do you think is reading? Tess, you're cheating. The options are grandfather or grandson. Okay, well, a lot of you are cheating, but a lot of you are right because, yeah, I would vote it's neither. It is a trick question because neither one of these people are engaged in the process of reading. We've got the grandfather who is listening to what he's hearing, but he can't look at the text and understand it. We've got the grandson who is looking at the text and decoding it, but doesn't understand the story, right? So neither one of these people is engaged in the process of reading. And so this is a good way to kind of depict the idea of the simple view of reading. So the simple view of reading is a theoretical framework, and most of my work is grounded in this in some way. And we've got the idea that word recognition, that's what the grandson was doing, word recognition multiplied by listening comprehension equals reading comprehension. And so in order to actually be engaged in the process of reading comprehension, you have to have both sets of skills. You have to be able to do what the grandfather was doing, listen to a story and understand it. And you have to be able to do what the grandson was doing, look at the words on the page and decode them, right? And if you're only doing one of those things, you cannot say that you're engaged in the process of reading comprehension. So even though in a way, those of you who said both were right, the answer really is neither, because neither one of these people were engaged in reading comprehension. The grandson was engaged in word recognition, which is the ability to translate printed text into pronounceable words. And the grandfather was engaged in listening comprehension, or the ability to understand text if it's heard instead of read. And so in that way, the ability to understand text requires both of those skills. And the most important thing about this particular slide is the multiplication sign in between the two, because the multiplication sign in between the two really is highlighting the fact that these skills compound over time. So just like if any of you have been thinking about, investing in your retirement or future financially at all, and you've learned about compound interest, that's exactly what happens here, is that these skills compound upon each other. We need to have something in each of these purple blocks in order for them to grow together. If one of these purple blocks is a 0, so if we've got word recognition and that value is a 0, what is 0 times listening comprehension? Or what is anything times 0 is 0. So your reading comprehension scores are going to be 0 if your word recognition value is 0, right? So there's no way to be able to have a good score in reading comprehension if you have no word recognition skills. And the same is true for listening comprehension. So we need to have values or content or skills in both of these areas in order to actually be engaged in the process of reading comprehension. Now, importantly, these skills change over time. So the simple view of reading allows us to think about how those skills change over time. Now, this is going to depend pretty substantially on the curricula that your school is using or your place is using, because word recognition is a really heavy focus early on in development, and rightfully so, because those are easier, quote unquote, easier skills to focus on. So that's a lot of our code-based skills, our letter sound recognition, letter sound correspondence, that awareness. So those word recognition skills are a heavy focus early on in life. And later on, listening comprehension becomes the heavier focus. Now, in the United States, what I'll say is most of our curricula, we've got this switch that happens at about grade 3 or 4, which is about ages 8 or 9, where we've got a switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And curriculum from that point on, from age 9 on, is focused on your ability to comprehend what you're hearing. And there's very little focus on your ability to understand what you're decoding, to actually decode words. There's very little focus on decoding skills past age 9. So what does that mean for kids who don't develop decoding skills in an age appropriate way? Well, they're at a disadvantage, and that gap continues to widen over time. And so importantly, what we know is that reading is a language-based skill. And if you take one thing away from our time together today, I hope it's this, that you remember and internalize that reading is a language-based skill. Our role in reading is so imperative because we have to focus on language for this population of kids. And those who are just joining, we are recording. So you'll have access to what you may have missed through a recorded link later. So this is another way to conceptualize the simple view of reading. This is called the reading rope. If you have not seen this image, excuse me, it's pretty ubiquitous. You'll see it everywhere. If you Google the reading rope, you'll just see a half a dozen iterations of it. I like this one because it's colorful, and I think it does a nice job of really visually drawing in the idea of what we're looking at here. So what you see is we've got language or listening comprehension in the top, and that's what the grandfather was doing. And that as we increase these skills over time, we become increasingly strategic readers. And then we've got in the bottom, kind of the red strands, we've got word recognition, and this is what the grandson was doing. And these skills, as we increase them over time, allow us to become increasingly automatic readers. But we do need to be both automatic and strategic. And so these skills wind together over time, and we eventually get to this point of skilled, fluent execution of reading, which in the United States is about third grade, age 8. We expect kids to be there, where they can automatically recognize words. That's the idea of sight word recognition here, which we won't have time to talk about today, but I do have kind of a whole soapbox on sight word recognition because it's a lot more complex than we call it just sight words, or there's just a lot more to it. We won't have time to go into that today, but the idea is that as you increase your ability to recognize printed words, you do become more automatic at reading. And so for those of you who are in the audience and who are readers, I would argue that the majority of the words that you encounter are sight words, that you don't do much active decoding anymore as an active reader. Now, today you may have done some active decoding when you saw my last name, Farquharson, because it's unlikely that you've seen that word before, and so perhaps didn't know exactly how to pronounce it or activate its meaning in your memory. But the majority of words you encounter are just so automatic for you that you're not engaging in active decoding anymore. And so we really do value that that combination of automaticity and strategy. So then how does this apply to phonological impairments? Well, we're talking about two broad groups of kids, but what we're thinking about here is this idea of phonological awareness. I'm going to spend a lot of time digging into that. And I want to just take a minute here to highlight that even though I'm going to spend the majority of the rest of our time together talking about the importance of phonological awareness, I do want to make sure that you keep this image or a version of this image that you prefer kind of in the front of your mind, because even though phonological awareness is important, it is one of the many important skills that a child needs to have in order to be a skilled reader. And so it's not just phonological awareness. There is a lot more to it. But our kids with speech sound disorders in particular tend to really experience difficulties in that area. And so we're going to spend a little bit more time thinking about that one. Okay, so phonological impairments, who are we actually talking about? So we're talking about both speech sound disorders and dyslexia. And so as I'm going to be referring to speech sound disorders, I don't really push heavily on the difference between articulation and phonology. And I'll explain why on the next slide. And then we're also going to talk about kids who have dyslexia. We'll go into a deep dive of what dyslexia actually is. But the reason I don't spend a lot of time differentiating articulation versus phonology is that it's often the case that we don't know the difference. It's often the case that we are making an assumption about the diagnosis without actually having the data to support it. And so it is usually the case that we're making a premature assumption about what the actual underlying processing deficit is. So for articulation disorders, we're often emphasizing putative problems in the motor programming system. And for phonological disorders, we're also emphasizing cognitive representations of speech as the underlying cause. But for the majority of kids that we treat, most of them actually have an idiopathic speech sound disorder, which means we cannot in good confidence say that it's articulation based or say that it's phonological based. They kind of live somewhere in between. And over time, we might be able to clarify that a bit more, but so many of them are incorrectly diagnosed because we make an assumption about the underlying skills without really focusing on what they are, without really testing them. But broadly, what we're talking about then of speech sound disorders, we're talking about a delay in the acquisition of language appropriate speech sounds. And that represents about 11 to 13% of children between the ages of 5 and 7. That is a US based statistic. And I'm sure that there are different statistics across different countries. But these kinds of studies are so hard to collect because it's really hard to capture prevalent data depending on the country that you live in. And so you can kind of take this with a grain of salt as well, that it may not be as representative, or in fact, you may find that there could be a higher percentage where you live. And so then we move up the population of kids that I initially studied when I started out as a researcher 12 years ago, was kids between the ages of 9 and 11. I was really interested in those older elementary kids. I'm using air quotes if you weren't watching. Those older elementary kids, approximately 10% of that population of kids have a persistent speech sound disorder. So those are the kids I mentioned at the beginning that I'm really just kind of perplexed by, because I'm really trying to understand why they hang on for so long and what we can do differently in their treatment to help them improve. And so when we say language appropriate sounds, we're talking about sounds in the ambient language. And so a good example of a sound that is a common error in the English language is that lateral lisp that we often hear. So that lateral fricative, so shun instead of sun, or hue instead of shoe, that lateral fricative is an actual phoneme in the International Phonetic Alphabet and in other languages, but it is not a phoneme in the English language. So anytime you see a child that you're working with who starts using a phoneme that's not in their native language, you automatically know that one, they're automatically at risk for reading disorders, and two, they very likely have a disorder as opposed to a delay, because it's really unusual to start using phonemes that are not in your native language, that are not phonemes you've heard. And that lateral fricative, it's not a distortion, it's a different phoneme in a different language. And so anytime you see that happening, it wouldn't be any different than a child who started using a click, for instance, a tongue click, which is a phoneme in other languages, but not in English. And so that lateral fricative is really problematic. So we want to make sure that we would provide services as early as possible for that particular kind of error. But in English, we know that all speech sounds should be acquired before the age of 6. And that comes from your colleague in Australia, Sharon McLeod, and her doctoral student who has since graduated and moved on to wonderful things in her life, but Kate Crow. They had an article in 2018, which I'm assuming that you're familiar with, where they talked about speech sound acquisition across multiple different languages. And then their 2020 publication was specific to English within the United States. And without too much backstory, and certainly without focusing too much on US-based practice, I did have a chance to work with Sharon McLeod on a paper where we dug into how her research is related to US public school policy, because there's a lot of specific guidelines that we have to follow in the US to determine that a child's eligible for services. And so if anyone were to be looking for understanding of what this means within the context of US schools, that article is available in Topics in Language Disorders. There's a free version of it on my website, which is in your handout and shared on some of the links. However, I think even if you're not a US-based SLP, there's still some good information in that article just about how to apply that research within a school-based context. One important thing that's important to know about this idea of the speech sound acquisition norms is that those norms are not diagnostic. So it's not the case that they were ever intended from any of the researchers who have ever published or studied speech sound norms. There's never been an intention that it would mean that if a child doesn't have a certain sound by a certain age, that is or is not that does or does not mean they have an issue or a problem or disorder or delay, something diagnosable. They're not diagnostic. So it's not the case that you can kind of look at your chart and say, oh, they can't make the S sound and they're 3, that's okay. It might not be okay. In fact, if they're making a lateral fricative instead of that S, it's definitely not okay. So those speech sound norms are not diagnostic in nature. And if you do want to hear a little bit more about that, if you happen to be a podcast listener, the See, Hear, Speak podcast is hosted by Tiffany Hogan, who was my PhD advisor in Nebraska in the United States. And she's got a wonderful podcast. And I was interviewed with Holly Storkel in episode 3 of that podcast. We talk all about this idea of speech sound norms not being diagnostic. But we know that for, this is again, a US based stat, but I think the same is going to be true if you're a pediatric SLP. And this of course depends on whether or not you are, if there are SLPs providing services in schools or not, which varies, I know. But in the US, the children with speech sound disorders are the primary population treated by school-based SLPs. And we also know that speech sound disorders can impact academic, linguistic, vocational, social, emotional skills in children and adolescents. And that's found to be true even once that speech sound disorder has remediated. So this kind of gets back to that very first slide where I kind of had the matrix of different kids, where we had the gold star group of kids, because what we see is that sometimes their speech sound production improves, but they're still experiencing difficulties with academic, linguistic, vocational, social, emotional skills. And so we can improve the speech sound production, but that does not mean we've resolved the problem. In fact, we know that 50 to 70% of children with speech sound disorders require some level of special education through 12th grade. And about 50% of children with speech sound disorders experience difficulties with reading. And this is not an exhaustive list of research that supports this, but the majority of the time, the reason that we see this deficit is related to their phonological awareness skills. And that's a necessary prerequisite for reading success. And we're going to talk a little bit more about phonological awareness. So when we think about this idea of risk of reading difficulties, we've got typically developing children here, children with speech sound disorders only, and then children with a speech sound disorder paired with a language impairment. And it's kind of been the case that children with speech sound disorders only kind of fall through the cracks, and that's particularly true in US public schools, that these children don't receive services or are seen to be not as severely involved, not needing services in the same way, which sure, a child who has a speech sound disorder and a language impairment, it absolutely requires services and needs, is going to need support to be successful with reading. But we know more and more now about the overlap between speech sound disorders and dyslexia. So that group of children who have speech sound disorders only are very likely to include a population, a subpopulation of children who have dyslexia. So we simply cannot ignore that population of children who have a speech sound disorder in isolation. Their language can be normal, but that does not mean that speech sound disorder is their only diagnostic category. In fact, for many of these kids, that speech sound disorder was an early warning sign of dyslexia. It was showing us that they do not have command of the phonological system. And so that is perpetuated throughout all of the different areas in which they might need to use phonology, which includes, of course, word reading. And so we think about what dyslexia is then. Dyslexia is a language-based problem. It's a phonological processing disorder. It is neurobiological in origin, present from birth, and usually experienced for life, which means that it is absolutely possible to be a successful reader as a person who has dyslexia, but the dyslexia itself will never go away. So yes, we can put strategies in place and help a person become a successful reader, but the dyslexia is neurobiological, so it is not going to go away. It is something that they will experience for life. We see it as a spectrum disorder, so it can range from an annoyance to severe limitation. It is definitely more common than any other kind of learning disability. And importantly, it is responsive to expert informed instruction. So we know how to help children who have dyslexia. We just need to identify them, and understanding that overlap between speech sound disorders and dyslexia is a very important first step for SLPs, because that's an early warning sign for us that there is something awry in the phonological system. So we typically characterize dyslexia by thinking about weaknesses in word reading, phonemic decoding, and spelling. And dyslexia is often a surprising diagnosis because this weakness exists in the presence of normal intelligence. We also see that, as I mentioned, because this is a lifelong neurobiological difference, it is present in adults who've compensated, but those adults might experience that they are poorer spellers. Maybe they're still very slow at reading, and they have difficulty with novel and complex phonological forms. So importantly, what dyslexia is not, because there's still a lot of misconceptions about what dyslexia is. Dyslexia is not characterized or diagnosed by seeing letters backwards. It is not indicative of a gifted status. And we do not have to wait until 3rd grade, that's about age 8, to make a diagnosis of dyslexia. We can diagnose it much, much earlier, and we absolutely should. Dyslexia is not a visual problem. And so as a result, it won't be responsive to colored lenses or eye tracking exercises, colored overlays, prism lenses, anything along those lines are not going to be effective for improving dyslexia because it's not a visual problem. There are some ways to identify dyslexia earlier, and I'm going to really make a sweeping statement here over this slide instead of going into the details just for the sake of time, which is basically that there have been both speech production and speech perception studies done in very young babies that have identified early warning signs and or predictive markers of dyslexia. So there are ways to identify dyslexia much, much earlier, and a lot of them are related to how we process and produce speech. So that, that connection is very early in development. So now that we've kind of talked about the simple view of reading and thought about this framework of language comprehension or listening comprehension and word recognition, we're going to focus heavily just on the word recognition part of the simple view of reading. So we're kind of thinking about all of these skills, and we're going to do a deeper dive into the idea of phonological processing through the phonological processing theory of reading. And so the idea about this phonological processing theory of reading, it was developed here at Florida State University in the Florida Center for Reading Research by Rick Wagner and Joe Torgeson. And the idea is that decoding printed words draws upon 3 primarily phonologically oriented skills: phonological awareness, rapid automatized naming, and verbal short-term memory. So I will tell you about each one of those. Our first one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, phonological awareness. This is the awareness of the sound structures of the English language or of the language, doesn't have to be English, any language. And we often measure this through rhyming, blending, and deletion kinds of tasks. I kind of have this spectrum that I put phonological awareness skills along. So there's not just one set of skills that represent phonological awareness. There are multiple kinds of skills that fall under the phonological awareness umbrella or are considered part of this continuum. I have them organized here from linguistically easier to linguistically harder. And that distinction is really important because the kids that we're thinking about and talking about, those who have dyslexia and or a speech sound disorder, they might find all of these skills really challenging. So it doesn't mean that these skills are going to be easier for that child. We're simply meaning that it's linguistically speaking, these skills over here are going to be easier, such as rhyming. So we're talking about whole words, whole linguistic units. It's easier to manipulate and think about words in larger linguistic units like you do in rhyming. And then as we move through, we've got sentence segmentation, syllable segmentation and blending, identification of final or initial phonemes within words, and then manipulation of individual phonemes. And these squares here that are blue, those are phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness falls under the umbrella of phonological awareness and is kind of a standalone skill. And that's important to know because phonemic awareness is much harder. So if we use those terms interchangeably, we're really confusing a very important concept because they're not interchangeable terms. Phonemic awareness is much more challenging than the broad phonological awareness skills. So when I think about these, I think about phonological awareness, I call them eyes shut tasks, where we're not referring to the print or the orthography. So we're saying, tell me a word that rhymes with cat. It might be mat. Or tell me the word cat without k, and you might say at. Or tell me, say the word bookworm without book. Or say cowboy without cow, and you would have to delete the syllable to say boy. And so all of those, you're just listening and you're just hearing the auditory input and processing it, and you're not looking at any print, as opposed to phonics or orthographic awareness, where I think of these as eyes open tasks because you're thinking about and referring to the orthography or the print, right? So that's phonics, and that's actually a different skill set. The skills themselves or the activities themselves are going to look and sound very similar. The main difference is whether or not we include orthography. And that's important to acknowledge because orthography can be a facilitative support for some kids, but it can also make things a lot more challenging. So for other kids, it's not facilitative. So we just want to be mindful of what exactly we're asking the child to do. So in this next slide, I'm going to ask again for you to interact in the chat with me. And just a few things. I'm seeing Jenny's note that yes, if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat. We will have time at the end set aside for questions. And also this is being recorded, so you'll have access to this if you've come in later. So what we're going to do here, and I'll ask you to type in the chat your response to each of the 9 items. I want you to think about each one of these words that you see on the screen. And even though you have the orthography present, I want you to just think about the word, the phonemes in the word, and segment the phonemes, and then reverse the order of the phonemes, ignoring the spelling. And for each time, you'll blend the words back together and come up with a new real word. So for example, in the word teach, you'll have t, e, ch, and you'll reverse that to ch, e, t, and you'll get the word cheat. Okay, so we'll do the next one together. The next word is sigh. And what do you get when you reverse the phonemes in sigh? Yeah, it's actually ice. S. It's not eyes because the word is not zai. The word is sigh. So we have to pay close attention to that voicing there. What about cuts? Stuck. Yep. What about speak? Keeps. Yep. Jab. Badge. Good. Seen. Yep. It's actually niece, right? And not knees, again, because of that voicing, right? Seen, niece, might, time, tax, tax becomes scat, at, and then caught. Talk. Excellent. You guys have excellent phonological awareness. Yes. So that's an idea there of just, how complex it can be to really think about the phonology behind a word when you've mostly been administering phonological awareness tests to young children. That's one that kind of makes it a little bit more challenging. So for our sake of time, I'm actually going to breeze through these next 3 slides. This slide is the relations between phonological awareness and speech sound disorders at the preschool level. And the takeaway here, you can read each one of the bullets in your handout, but the takeaway here is that even when language is normal, children who have speech sound disorders often have poor phonological awareness in preschool. The kids who have even greater risk for difficulties with phonological awareness in preschool are the ones who have atypical speech sound errors, and that includes things like that lateral lisp, which is not a typical error. That's not a sound in English, so that's not a typical error. And then other kinds of phonological patterns you might see, like backing, initial sound deletion, those kinds of phonological patterns that are not part of typical development. So those kids are at marked weakness risk for difficulties with phonological awareness. On this next slide, this is for our school age population. Again, we see that children who have speech sound disorders continue to have difficulties with phonological awareness. What's really interesting is the second bullet where they've done fMRI testing, where they're looking at the blood in the brain barriers, membranes, to see where the brain blood moves to highlight which parts of the brain are active during certain processing tasks. And during phonological processing tasks, they found that kids who had speech sound disorders exhibited cortical and subcortical differences in how their brains process phonological information compared to children of the same ages, 8.5 to 10, who did not have speech sound disorders. So there's a cortical and subcortical difference in phonological abilities that's observable through technology like fMRI. And then this last slide is for adolescents. Again, we see the same story is true, that we see children who have speech sound disorders continue to have difficulty with phonological processing. And for some kids, that's true even once their speech sound disorder has been remediated. So, there's certainly a question there of what's the directionality of this, like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did they have a speech sound disorder because they have weak phonological working memory, for instance, or do they have weak phonological working memory because they've had a speech sound disorder for so long? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we do know that there's certainly deficits in phonological working memory and phonological processing that continue through adolescence for this population of kids. So when we get back to the phonological processing theory of reading, we've talked about phonological awareness there. Let's talk about rapid automatized naming. So this is a measure, if you're not familiar with it, where you are measuring the speed at which children retrieve and name the lexical codes associated with known items, such as colors, objects, or letters. So this is an example of a now outdated test that's used purposefully, so I'm not worried about copyright, where the child would go through, in this example, say red, blue, yellow, green, black, purple, yellow, green, black, and be naming these colors rapidly to try to really get at that lexical access. We know that this skill of rapid automatic naming, which I'll call RAN, is associated with word decoding skills in children who are typically developing and children who have dyslexia. But there have been mixed findings for kids who have language impairment and for our kids who have speech sound disorders. And finally, we'll talk about verbal short-term memory. Verbal short-term memory, this is the storage of auditorily presented information. And this is a mechanism that is often used to maintain memory of the sounds in decoded graphemes when continuing to decode later graphemes in a word. So the reason why you can read a really long word when you're decoding it for the first time and then be able to put it together so quickly is because of your verbal short-term memory that retains what you've already decoded and helps you piece together the latter part of the word. And so if you've worked with kids like I have, who start decoding part of a word and do really well, and they get to the end of the word and they can't put it all together because their memory has just given up on them, right? So it's not that they couldn't decode the word, they decoded every aspect of the word correctly, they just didn't have the verbal short-term memory skills to pull it all together. And so we see this measured often through digit recall tasks. I'm going to give you some examples of all of these too. For kids who have speech sound disorders, they do often have difficulties with verbal short-term memory. And that has been confirmed again through fMRI studies where the neural regions that are activated during verbal short-term memory tasks are different in children with speech sound disorders compared to children with typical speech production abilities. And that's a different study than the one I just talked about too. So there's multiple studies suggesting that the neural regions that are activating are different than between children who are typically speaking compared to those who have a speech sound disorder. So as far as our assessment considerations, if we are tying it to the phonological processing theory of reading, I think we should be testing all three of these skills in our speech sound production evaluations, because this is hopefully going to help to provide us with a much more in-depth examination of the phonological processing skills of children who have speech sound disorders and potentially also have dyslexia. So for children who have are being evaluated for a speech sound disorder, we can test phonological awareness using a few different kinds of measures. So in the PAST, the phonological awareness screening test is a free screener. So if you Google PAST Kilpatrick, the website will come up. It's freely available and free to download. The comprehensive test of phonological processing and the TILS, or test of integrated language and literacy. All of these are great measures to include. You don't have to use all of them, but they're all great measures to include in a speech sound evaluation. For rapid automatized naming, we can test that using a subtest from the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test 3. That's what I use in my lab. But also I highly recommend here just collaborating with an educational psychologist or reading specialist. This may not be a test that you have access to, and that's okay, but I would then just collaborate with someone who could administer that test for you as a part of a team-based evaluation. And then for verbal short-term memory, again, I like the CTOP and the TILS. So I think the CTOP can really address a lot of the concerns that we often have for kids who have speech sound disorders and dyslexia. It's a really great test to get at a lot of different skills. So with the time we have remaining, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about how I incorporate phonological awareness into my speech sound therapy sessions. So the first important context, or the first important point that I want to make, is to not teach phonological awareness as a splinter skill, meaning we should not be working on it using flashcards or something that kind of decontextualizes it, but instead we should be contextualizing it and helping kids understand how and why they would be using the skills you're trying to teach them. So this idea of teaching phonological awareness skills in context helps to provide support for understanding when those skills are needed. And so it's not the case that for kids who have speech sound disorders and or dyslexia that they can't understand, or they're not going to make improvements in phonological awareness if we don't provide context. That's not the case, but it is going to help strengthen those connections and make it more obvious to them why those skills matter. And so the first place to start is to really be very strategic about how you choose your words for therapy. If you are working in a school-based setting, I always love to choose words from the curriculum. So vocabulary lists or spelling lists. I also, if you don't have access to those or don't have time to find them or aren't working in a school setting, I love choosing words from popular or common storybooks, children's picture books, graphic novels, really any book that the child is interested in. That's going to help. That's going to provide the context you're looking for. Importantly, don't let commercialized products govern which words you use. So I see so often SLPs download something from Teachers Pay Teachers or download something from Etsy, there are great content creators on those websites, but there are a lot of not great content creators on those websites. And so if you're letting something that's commercialized, or if it's a company like Super Duper or something like that, and if you're letting those companies, those sellers decide for you which words to use, you might not be able to provide the kind of context you want to, and you certainly might not be able to create facilitative contexts that are going to help make your therapy easier. And I'm going to tell you all about a workshop that I have available on what I mean by facilitative context. So really be strategic about the words that you choose. So I'm going to walk you through an example of what I would do if I were working on the sh sound for a child in kindergarten. So I looked at kindergarten and first grade vocabulary list. That for me was just a Google search. I don't work in an elementary school anymore. So I just did a Google search of kindergarten and first grade vocabulary words and found ones that started with initial SH. And I chose to focus only on initial SH at the starting point for this particular child. And I only pick 5 to 10 words for my speech therapy sessions. Now I want to get a high dosage, right? So I want to get 100 to 150 trials in every session for every kid. But I'm not going to use 100 to 150 words to do that. I'm going to pick a short list of words, maximum of 10. If I rarely ever have any more than 10. In fact, I rarely ever have more than 5. So I'm going to pick 5 words that are really going to give me a bang for my buck. And I'm going to be very systematic about why I chose them. So I'm going to think about different vowel contexts, which again, I'm not going to go into those details today, but I'll tell you about a workshop of mine that is available that you can learn more about that. I'm going to try to look at different nouns, verbs, and adjectives to try to cross linguistic boundaries there. And I'm going to really focus on how I can target these specific words really strategically for this child. So if you're familiar with any sort of contrastive approach to speech sound therapy, like multiple oppositions or minimal pairs, then what I'm about to describe is going to sound very similar to those because it's based on those, where we're trying to get a lot of contrast, high dosage, and we don't need a lot of words to do that. So what I'm going to have the child do is I'm going to say to the child, how many words can you think of that rhyme with shade? So that's our first word on the list. How many words can you think of that rhyme with shade? And before they tell me any of the words they can think of, they first have to say shade with that good SH sound, right? So depending on what kind of cues you might be giving the child cues to round their lips. Sorry, my dog is knocking at my office door. And so you might be kind of giving them that visual cue of rounding their lips. Okay, you have to tell me your word first before you give me other words that rhyme with it. So I want to hear shade, made. Okay, good. That rhymes. What's another one? Shade, paid. Yep, that rhymes. Shade, fade. Good. That also rhymes. So I'm getting a lot of trials and a lot of dosage, but I'm also working on their ability to generate rhymes, right? So they're thinking of rhyming words, but every time they're tying in a word from their linguistic repertoire, they have to say shade with their good SH sound. So you're getting lots and lots of trials while also simultaneously working on rhyming. And so then the next thing I might do is, what happens if I take away the sh sound from shade and change it to then I get raid. So I can kind of play around with that initial sound awareness of what happens when I take sh away and change sh to Now I get made, shade, made. And they have to say both because they have to get that practice in saying those rhyming words, but also practicing that SH sound. If I move on to the next word, another word in my list, sheep. Again, can you think of words that start with the same sound? Can you think of words that end with the same sound? Can you think of words that rhyme? But then I'm also going to talk about how those words can end in the same sound and rhyme, and some words end in the same sound and don't rhyme. And so we can talk about how a word like hop ends with the same sound as sheep, but does not rhyme. But we have a word like weep that ends with the same sound, and that does rhyme. So we're going to really dig into those initial and final sound awareness. And for every one of those words we talk about, sheep, weep, sheep, hop, we're saying sheep every time because we're trying to get lots and lots of trials for practicing that SH sound. Then we're going to expand that to work on vocabulary. And so I'm going to stick with the word sheep just for this example. So can you think of other words that are from the same category? So if you have a child who's working on speech sound production and vocabulary, you can think of words that are from the same category. And for this category, we would call that farm animals, right? And so every time you think of a farm animal, you have to first say sheep, because we're going to get that SH trial in there. Sheep, cow, sheep, pig, sheep, horse, sheep, goat, right? So they're naming and categorizing, but they're getting lots and lots of trials with that SH sound. And then we can kind of play around with that. So can you think of, you can make it really specific. Can you think of words from the same category and start with the same sound? So sheep, that's kind of a hard one. So you might get sheepdog, but there's not a lot of other options. But then you can say, how about animals that start with the same sound as sheep? And what's that sound again? Shh. Let's make it again. Shh, right? So we're getting lots and lots of trials there, but aren't farm animals. So now we have shark and shrimp and shellfish. And then we can really expand on that for our vocabulary lesson. What makes a sheep the same as a shark? What makes a sheep and a shark different? And then when they're explaining it, you have a sound loaded sentence built for you. A sheep is like a shark because blank. A sheep is not like a shark because blank, right? And you can really dig into that. I often have a lot of kids who also are not just working on vocabulary, but are also working on morphosyntax. And so I always try to include in my list of 5 words, I always try to include at least one verb. Okay, I got to let him in. Hold on 1 second. Okay, come on, hurry up. Sorry, my little office buddy. Okay, so I always try to include at least one verb so that I can work on past tense ED or other kinds of morphosyntax things that typically occur more with our verbs than with our nouns. And so I am going to focus on the word shriek. Okay, let's see. What does it mean to shriek? Can you think of other words that mean the same thing as shriek? And whenever we say any of the words that mean the same thing as shriek, what do we have to do? We have to first say shriek. Shriek, yell, shriek, shout, shriek, scream, shriek, holler, right? So anytime they're thinking about a word that means the same as shriek, they have to say shriek so we get all of our SH practice. And then we're also thinking about words, so we've got the the vocabulary piece, semantic piece, where we're thinking of words that mean the same thing. And then I'm going to show you how we can talk about in a second, how we can talk about adding the morphosyntax piece. So something else I do whenever I'm working on a category or something like this, if I can find a way to put it on a spectrum or graph it out, use a visual graphic organizer in some way to help kids understand how words are the same and different. When you've got a group of words like this that all kind of mean the same thing, so all of these words kind of mean scream, I try to say, okay, so scream is something we do when we're upset, right? But some of these words we would use to describe screaming when we're less upset. And some of these words we would use to describe screaming when we're more upset. So we're kind of got this continuum here. So we're going to put them along a continuum. I'm going to buzz through this because I know I'm out of time or running out of time. So your spectrum is going to look different than mine. And that's perfectly fine because that's the way that language works. But then we go back through. Now, which one of these words starts with your sound, right? So we're going to remind the child of the purpose of this, identifying which words start with your sound. So we've got shout, we've got shriek. Now, which of these words starts with the same letter as your sound, but actually makes a different sound? So now we're tying in orthography here. So we've got screech starts with S, just like shout and shriek, but shout makes sh sound and screech makes sound. So let's make those sounds again. Shout, screech, shriek, screech, and scream, right? So we've got a way to kind of pull orthography in. While we've just talked about speech sound production, we have talked about vocabulary, we have tied in orthography. And now we can go through this list and tie in morphosyntax by making all of these words past tense. Today I yelp, yesterday I yelped, right? So we can make each one of these past tense. And then I also like to teach kids that voicing rule that you might know, and I'm gonna explain it quickly, but if you don't know it, I can go into more detail, where the way that a word ends, if it ends in a voiceless phoneme, then the past tense ed that we add is going to sound like the voiceless T. If the word ends in a voiced phoneme, then the past tense ed that we add is going to sound like a voiced D. And if the word that we're talking about ends in a T or a D, then the past tense ed that we add is going to sound like the syllable ed. So we've got shrieked, screamed, and shouted. Right, so we've got all those voicing things that change that can make it really challenging for kids who are working on learning, decoding, and writing to hear those differences. It's hard to tell a child that shrieked ends in ed when it sounds like a T, right? So if they spell it with a T, they actually have really good phonological awareness because that's what it sounds like. But I find that when we teach them that skill, that rule, they do really well with that. Some kids can handle that really well. I just want to make a few final pleas for advocacy, because I know you may or may not have the opportunity to be working in a school, but depending on where you're working, these kids are kids with speech sound disorders. They're at risk for reading difficulties, even if it's not dyslexia. And so it's really important that we advocate for a seat at the table, that it's really important for SLPs to be in schools. And if that's not happening where you are, we're really the only phonology experts. Every reading specialist I've worked with has just been absolutely phenomenal and brilliant in so many ways, but they don't understand phonology like we do. So it's a really important source of advocacy for us to understand phonology as it relates to reading and speech production and spelling. If you are in the schools, this is again a US focus, but this is a paper that we wrote for the Journal of School Leadership, which is a journal in the United States that's focused on elementary school principals, superintendents, directors of special education, but the leadership team that would govern a school, that would make decisions about what SLPs can and cannot do. So this is a nice article that if it's relevant to your setting, you might want to consider sharing. And we as a part of that created this infographic where you've got 10 action steps to help leadership support SLPs in schools a little bit better. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. This is my contact information, a few additional webinars and resources I promised I would talk about quickly. First is the Embracing Expertise series. If you are interested in best practices for treating speech sound disorders, we've created 4 courses. So we have 4.5 hours of pre-recorded content available on bethebrightest.com. Go to courses and you'll see all 4. They're reasonably priced. So phonetic science for clinical practice is 90 minutes and is $30. And the remaining 3 are 60 minutes and $20, $20 US. And so this is where I have the webinar available for facilitative context for targets and words. But really, if you work with kids with speech sound disorders, this helps you understand speech sound production in a whole new way. 4.5 hours of content. And then I do have, I don't know how popular speechpathology.com is in Australia, but I do have several courses there as well. This one, incorporating phonological awareness and orthography into speech sound therapy, is a little bit more in depth version of what I just did when I kind of walked through the sheep and shark examples. So it's, if you, that goes into those examples in more detail, but it's going to be redundant to what you just saw. The other ones have a little bit more varying information, and then some podcasts that I was interviewed on. And okay, I'm going to stop there and just bring it back to my contact information, so make sure you have access to that. And then I'd love to hear any questions you have. And I know we have some time to talk a little bit more about how you think this might apply to your setting, your practice, the work that you're doing. But yes, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I'm coming. That was fantastic. And I thought I could speak fast, but that was amazing. Well done.
I'm a good fast speaker.
Yeah, and you haven't lost your voice.
I don't know if it's a good thing, but
amazing, such great content. And at the Reading and Writing Centre, we do strongly advocate for the role of speech pathologists in that early identification, prevention of reading and writing disorders. And I know Jenny Peach has always been someone to advocate for the importance of identifying and remediating speech sound disorders in school age children. So that's an important question. Can we see the dog? Thank you for that.
He is 15. Oh. And he's showing signs of that at every turn. But thank you for asking, Christy.
That's beautiful. So a lot of our work is building like the skills and knowledge of speech pathologists, but also the teaching staff. So we're in schools and working with them, and we're on inclusive education teams and advocating for that and trying to support the team to understand the importance of identifying those students with speech sound disorders, language difficulties, and then how they can be supported in the classroom. Do you have some tips that you generally talk to around teachers supporting these kids in the classroom? I know that wasn't, we're really focusing on speech pathology, but that's what we do a lot of.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think there's so much that we can do. I think I've been really amazed by the teachers that I've worked with. And I think a lot of them get great training on things like letter sound awareness. But I have noticed that a lot of the times when I've gone into the classroom and have done a phonological awareness lesson, for instance, that we just kind of think about phonemes differently. So modeling the way that we would talk to a child about a phoneme is really such an important skill that we can model for teachers. Even just that idea of voicing, right? So, in our examples of some of the words that when we're reversing some of the phonemes, that we had to think about voicing of S and Z, at the end of a word like bus, we've got no voicing here. And then we've got buzz where we've got voicing. Even just that difference, that can sometimes help kids think about how they would spell a certain word, and there are certain rules that we have, like the past tense ED rule that I gave. Let me switch back to that. Where, if we've got a voiceless phoneme at the end of a word, like shriek, compared to if that were voiced, it would be a G, shriek. Right. And so we actually changed the sound of a morpheme based on the phonemes in the word. So because that phoneme is voiceless, we are adding ED, we're calling it ED, and that's the letters that we're going to put. But actually the sound that we hear is t, and that's because of the phoneme at the end of the word. So I think, the way that we think about phonology is just so different than most other educators. And talking through that can be really helpful for showing teachers how to think about and implement best practices with respect to phonological awareness. And I think another thing related to that I've seen is even just sounding out sounds. I've seen a lot of teachers that I've worked with that I've had to try to maybe gently try to correct, where they say things like M says ma. We're like, no, M says S says s, S does not say sa. Right. And so kind of those really, really basic, and yes, they are minutia, but when you've got a child who has a phonological disorder, and they think M says ma, and then they go to sound out the word me, it's going to sound like ma-e, right? And that's where we get these perpetuating issues with decoding because they don't even know how to say the sound, but it's because they've been told the wrong way. So some of those really minor, seemingly basic things, I think, are really important for teachers to hear.
Great. I do say we often talk about that, the nuances, the small details really matter when building the skills for reading and writing. There are some questions in the chat. Can you see some of those? I wonder if you...
Yes. Yes, I can. Yes. Okay. I'm interested in your thoughts about the importance of differential diagnosis between phonological versus articulation in the preschool age population. So it's a really good question. I think it's important to do a comprehensive evaluation to try to determine if you can find the underlying cause. But I think it's just as important to understand that you might not find it, right? Because a lot of the kids that I've tested, when we think about, what would it mean if they had an articulation disorder? How would I know? Well, I know because there's a motor processing deficit. That's what an articulation disorder is. I would say 85 to 90% of the kids with speech sound disorders that I've tested, not including kids with childhood apraxia of speech, most of them have completely normal motor processing from the way I evaluated it, right? So I'm looking at an oral mechanism exam to look at structure and function. I'm asking them to do a DDK to get their rate of buttercup or pudica, right? And so I'm measuring those, and all of those values come out normal. So I don't have data to support that there's a motor programming issue here. And in most clinical settings, particularly schools, you're not going to have the advanced technology necessary to really get like kinesthetic measurements on speed and velocity of muscle movement, right? And so it's really challenging actually to confirm the diagnosis of articulation disorder. It's very challenging, but you would never know that because we kind of throw it around so easily. And we, instead of saying, well, there's no motor issue here, we say they've only got one sound in error. And if they've only got one sound, then that's artic, and that's not true. That's never been the diagnostic criteria for articulation disorders. And so that's where I think the importance comes about, is just knowing that it's actually much more important that you say, we can't find an underlying cause here, we're going to call it a speech sound disorder, than it is to say this is an articulation disorder because of a certain number of sounds in error, which is not how you determine that. But I also know, especially in the US, there are some eligibility criteria that SLPs are required to follow that are just not in alignment with, dare I say, reality, but I will absolutely say science. They are not in alignment with what the science tells us about these different disorders. So I think it's incredibly important, but I think it's also, we kind of have to get familiar and comfortable with the fact that we live in a gray area sometimes, and we might not know exactly what's causing it.
That's
So
really
Emma
important.
is,
Did you, Kelly, go and attend the International Association of Communication Science Disorders? They recently had speech pathologists talking about the diagnostic criteria around speech sound disorders.
No, I did not.
Yeah, so I'm sure they videoed it. So it's not as cut and dried exactly as you were saying. So
yeah, it really isn't. And I think that's, in part, I think that's where we've gone wrong by these kids, is we've tried to make it an easy diagnosis, that we want it to be black and white. And I get that. I want it to be black and white too, but it's not. And I think that a lot of these kids have fallen through the cracks because we've not been able to correctly diagnose them. So Emma's asking about what sort of tasks do you recommend for children who have difficulties with verbal short-term memory? They can decode each sound in the word, but cannot blend them together. I think it's less about the tasks I would do and more about really trying to understand what the reason for that deficit is. Can we do more testing to really find out what's causing this verbal short-term memory issue? Is it related to dyslexia, or is it related to something much more complex and in-depth that we need to get an educational psychologist involved? There's not a lot of great tasks that will independently improve verbal short-term memory. If there's a deficit there, it's a part of usually a constellation of issues. And so I think it's more important to get a better sense of what the diagnosis is, and then to work broadly on what the symptoms are. So repeated reading, lots of practice, strengthening phonological awareness. I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support activities explicitly to strengthen verbal short-term memory. Excuse me, but that can vary based on what the actual diagnosis is. Yeah, and so then that's related to Neil's question too, of there's really not a lot of evidence to show that you can just improve that. It's kind of like, when people say, I want to do ab exercises to improve my, the way my abs look for bikini season, which we're entering. I know you're not, but we're entering. And people say, well, it's not really about just targeting one area. You really have to just kind of like broadly improve everything, like walking more, eating less. It's along those that same rationale of it's not really something you can strengthen independently, because it's so connected to everything else that you really have to try to understand the deficit in context with everything else. Yeah, and that's also related to Danielle's question too, Rachel. Yeah, so Rachel, actually, it's that reading rope slide is one that was developed by Hollis Scarborough, and it's freely available online, so you can absolutely use it. I would make sure you credit her for creating it for sure. Yeah, so a lot of similar questions about working on working memory. So I think these are really similar. They're really important questions to have. For preschoolers with speech sound disorders, what do you recommend in relation to phonological awareness? So Tamara, is that question about assessment or intervention? So everything I just mentioned is what I would do in my speech sound therapy sessions to include phonological awareness in those sessions. There's also a program that was developed by Melanie Shuley at Vanderbilt, and it's called the Intensive Phonological Awareness Program, IPA, so another IPA acronym for our field. And I just buy it on Amazon. It's like a $35 workbook. And I don't know how accessible that is there. Amazon, I think you have Amazon, yes. And so I really like that workbook. If you need something a little bit more structured, I really like that.
Thank you, Kelly. That's wonderful.
All righty. Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, Donna, for helping us through that question section that we had there. I'd really like to thank Kelly very much for this morning. It was an extremely informative session. And, as Donna said, at the Reading and Writing Centre, we're and in fact, everyone who's online today is working in education. This is open to people working in education across Australia, to speech pathologists. So we all work in education, and we understand that our role in education is to improve educational outcomes. So, when you talk about advocating for our place at the table, I guess part of the work that we do is around building the understanding of school leaders, of educators, of teachers, about the role that we have. But I think often too, and I think what you have helped us to do today, is that speech pathologists don't always necessarily see their work in reading, and it's not that you're working on reading, you are working on what we always work on as speech pathologists, but we've got that end point in mind, and we know the links and we understand the links. And so I think what you've done today is not only given us all a good idea of really deepened our understanding of our work, but really helped us to make that link to why we're in education, and that is to improve reading, to improve writing, to improve educational outcomes. So thank you so much. That has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad it was helpful, and I'm sensitive to the US based lens. I was worried that there were going to be so many things not relevant, but I'm happy to hear it's relevant, and I'd love to chat more another time, and would certainly love to be there in person, meeting all of you and seeing your beautiful country. So maybe someday.
Absolutely. We can talk.
Yes.
Let's see what we can make happen. All right. Well, thank you very much, Kelly, for staying up late and for doing this presentation for us. You can go and have dinner now.
Yeah.
And,
thank you so much. I hear my husband clanging around out there making dinner. So
wonderful.
I'm gonna do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and keep an eye out for our next research to practice. All right. Thank you, Kelly.